Hello and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. I'm Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, joined here by Dr. Michael Barber. Both of us are on the faculty at the Graduate School of Theology at the Augustine Institute. And we have come to the end here of Season 2 of The Chosen, Episode 8, which has the title Beyond Mountains. It was an interesting title. I actually didn't ever figure out exactly what it refers to.
I'm not sure. I think the idea is that the Sermon on the Mount is significant beyond it just being on a mountain.
Yeah.
That the location of the Sermon on the Mount is significant, but there's something that transcends just the earthly location of it.
Sure.
The major thrust of the episode is Jesus and the disciples' preparation for this Sermon on the Mount, this unveiling of Jesus, if you will, or as Barnaby puts it, the show that's about to take place here. And so we see Jesus is looking for an opening for his sermon in the opening scene, and he is going to eventually land on the Beatitudes, which he describes as a map that people can use to find him. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's also the scene of the disciples preparing.
There's a lot of preparation,
right,
basically in this episode. So a couple of dimensions of that we've got in a couple of clips here. So let's take a look at our first clip.
I think the knoll east of the Nahalka River looks promising.
But it's a knoll. He won't be high enough for people to see and hear him.
Yes, and the trees to the south obstruct the view of the Sea of Galilee, which he specifically requested.
Why does he need a view of the sea?
I think he wanted to be high enough up.
What about the hills north of Chorazin? Huh? There's plenty of height his voice would carry.
It's too steep of a climb.
And the distance is too far for the people from Tiberias and Magdala.
Yeah.
He said he wanted to keep within a day's walk from those cities.
Maybe we're just looking too far north.
What did he request? Grove of juniper or gum trees on the backside where we could camp the night before?
Yeah.
It's like he already knows the place.
Yeah. Just have to find it.
So Jesus has sent the disciples out to scout out the location where he'll deliver the sermon. And it's apparent to them that Jesus already seems to have a particular place in mind. Jesus already knows the place where he's going to deliver the sermon, which I thought was a nice nod to his divinity there, perhaps his divinity. I will say, if you're curious, there is a place in the Holy Land. It's known as the Mount of the Beatitudes. It's the traditional location of the Sermon on the Mount. I've got a picture of it here. It's a picture I took myself. And so you get a sense of what it would have looked like. You can see the Sea of Galilee is pretty prominent in the background there. I was hoping to see more of a sea background in The Chosen because of this. I realized there are difficulties in getting everything you want in production, so I understand that. But I thought it was significant that we see some disciples going out to prepare the place of the sermon, okay? Others are passing out flyers. Of course, this is unlikely that you would have paper like this.
They're advertising. They're just doing a little marketing.
Little marketing, yes, exactly. And that brings us to the person who is most expert in marketing and business, and that would seem to be in The Chosen, Judas Iscariot. Judas is now introduced in this episode. Why is it called Judas Iscariot? Iscariot is sort of unclear. Many think it relates to the idea that his father was from Kerioth, which was a town of Judea. We read about it in Joshua 15:25, for example. But in The Chosen, his introduction is part of a scene where there's a kind of swindle happening, right? Where Judas and his business partner are trying to buy land from this man who doesn't really seem to realize the value of what he has. And Judas is a little uncomfortable with this, we see in the episode. Now, in the scene, they're being dishonest. They're motivated by greed a bit. Perhaps there's a foreshadowing here of what we read in the Gospels, where Judas's betrayal is linked specifically to his greed in the Gospel of John. We see this in John chapter 12. If we go to the slides here, we read, Judas Iscariot, one of Jesus' disciples, who was to betray him, said, why was this ointment that is poured out on Jesus by a woman, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? And then the evangelist adds, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And being in charge of the money box, he used to take what was put in it. So I think the chosen producers are trying to help us figure out who Judas is. I'm thinking, I don't know for sure, that they're laying out that he was motivated by greed, maybe as John describes. We shall see. It's often the case that Judas is a mysterious figure in Jesus stories. His betrayal of Jesus is sort of ambiguous. In the Gospel of John, he's a thief. That's often not portrayed in Jesus films. So I'm curious to see if that becomes part of the narrative of the chosen.
Yeah, and you mentioned the kind of discomfort that Judas shows in this opening scene with this business deal that's, this kind of questionable business deal that's being carried out.
The man. Right?
Yeah, and it's there's a little tension between his discomfort there with then what you just showed us from John's gospel, where it sort of is just like he's a thief, but in this scene he's trying to kind of work things in a way that it's not quite as bad. He's actually trying to find the middle ground between the Jewish man from whom they're trying to buy the property and then his business partner who's just, out for blood, so to speak. Like no qualms. He just wants to get it for, they want to do salt mining, but they make up a story about tombs, and
right. Which was interesting because according to the gospel account, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, we read, but the chief priest took the pieces of silver. Judas comes back after he realizes Jesus is being executed and he regrets what he's done. And he brings back the silver. And what happens? The chief priests take the pieces of silver and they say, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury since they are blood money. After conferring together, they used the silver pieces to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. So in the end, in the Gospel of Matthew, Judas's money is used to build tombs for foreigners. So I wonder if there's a little nod to that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So it was interesting too that they say these are tombs for the middle classes.
Yeah.
And some of the these descriptions and even the concept of business in this way, maybe a little anachronistic.
Yeah, basically, in the literature of the time, there are two groups. There's the rich and the poor. That's it. There isn't a description of a middle class. And, they're concerned about the way their business's reputation will be known. It really isn't a sense that people thought about branding businesses in the first century quite like this, and businessmen different. You'd be part of a guild, and that isn't really discussed here at all either.
So, the main setup basically seems to be that Judas has some experience and some skill in business, and this is going to be likely taken up into the service of Jesus' own ministry. And he also has some qualms about uncouth business practices. I think that's kind of the essence of what they're trying to convey.
Just one little detail. At the end of the episode, Jesus is heading up to the stage to deliver his sermon, and he sees all the disciples there, and Judas is there. And this is the first time Jesus would have seen Judas, and I was a little surprised that there wasn't a kind of knowing look on Jesus's face when Judas had arrived. Anyway, it seemed Jesus had no reaction to seeing the man who would eventually betray him. And in the Gospels, Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. We see that clearly at the Last Supper. So anyway, now there are other things we could say here about the sermon itself as Jesus is prepping it with Matthew. He asks Matthew about its present state and how they need to continue organizing it. And he speaks of whether or not they need 20 sections or 19 sections. Let's take a look at a clip here where we see that in the dialogue between Matthew and Jesus.
How many sections are we up to?
19.
He's a little incomplete, huh?
There is something about 20 that is more symmetrical. You could always shorten it to 18.
Brevity is usually preferred. Which section stands out to you the most?
Do not be anxious about your life, of course.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about Matthew's role here, and so we don't need to drill into that more, but what stood out to me as I was watching this was the discussion of the sections.
Yeah,
The sections. What are these sections? As I, immediately, I don't need to look at the Bible for this. I know, for example, there are 48 verses just in Matthew 5. So it can't be that he's talking about the versification of the sermon. So it really got me thinking, what is this a reference to? How do they have these sections?
And it can't be chapters, which would be
Can't
the
be
other kind of
chapters.
section.
Right,
We
there
know.
are only 3 chapters.
Exactly. So
Right.
18, 19,
There are
20.
there are 28 chapters in Matthew, so it can't be a reference to the whole gospel. There are 16 chapters in Mark, 24 chapters in Luke. This can't be a reference to the chapters in the gospels, right? So what's going on here? So I went back and I looked at English Bible translations. And one thing that I found was that if you look at the New International Version, well, I looked at a number of translations first. Then the NRSV, the New RSV, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, they have these subheadings.
Right. So
Now,
like
that's
little
not in the
titles,
original. That's not in the RSV. That's not in the older RSV. It's not in the King James. But you have these little subheadings. They're not inspired. They're not part of the biblical text. They're put in there by the publisher to break up the material. They're 24, so that can't be right. Then I looked at the New International Version, which is probably the most popular Protestant translation. I also looked at the English Standard Version, and guess what? I counted it up. Now, I'm not that great at math. There are 3 kinds of people in this world: those that are good at math and those that are not. But I with my limited abilities, I tried to count the number of sections. And in the New International Version and in the ESV, the Sermon on the Mount is broken up into 20 subheadings, some subsections. In fact, one of them is in Matthew 6, in the New International Version, do not be anxious. And Jesus asks Matthew, what's your favorite section? And Matthew says, do not be anxious about your life. Yeah. So it does seem that what the producers of The Chosen are doing here is crafting the portrayal so that their video can be used for Bible study purposes, maybe?
Yeah.
It seems like they're really working hard to help people find what it is they're portraying in their Bibles.
Yeah, so this mysterious use of the word sections, there were 19, and they're talking about, well, should we shorten it to 18 or add something to go to 20? And with, later we see the addition of the Beatitudes, we take it ends up being 20 sections, which makes it align with the NIV and the ESV translation. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting way that they're trying to align the script with the actual Bibles in hand that folks are going to have as they're reading scripture, praying, maybe watching The Chosen. So it's a kind of a neat pastoral move, that they make.
Right. I think The Chosen producers realize that those subheadings were added by later translators. Right.
We've talked about there's a good amount of historical awareness, scriptural, theological awareness that they have. So for sure, they know this, and they're aiming to help people get to their Bibles, which is a great thing. So that added section is going to end up being the Beatitudes, and Jesus comes up with this pretty far along into the episode, and he presents this for the first time to Matthew, and we've got that in a clip. So let's take a look at that.
Rabbi.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven.
So in this clip, Jesus recites for the first time the Beatitudes, and he does this while looking down at the place where their sort of encampment is, and there are scenes that flash by of the various disciples, his chosen ones. And so there's a way that Jesus seems to be thinking about or focusing on his followers, his disciples, as he is crafting or at least reciting the Beatitudes. And that's an interesting move that they make. I did not expect that in the portrayal. And you know what, I liked some things about this. There's a really comforting dimension here, and this is certainly an important part of reading the Beatitudes, right? That Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. And we take this as his followers, as his disciples, we take this as an affirmation and a promise to us, right? And so it does refer to his disciples, and it should refer to them. Somehow I had more in my mind, the Catechism has a great line about the Beatitudes saying that, first of all, the Beatitudes paint a self-portrait of Christ. And so I was expecting somehow it to be more focused on Jesus's person, right, and describing him, because of course it's to the extent that we are like him that we are disciples.
Now, I did appreciate that Jesus, Jonathan Rumi, in the episode says that the disciples are a map to find him.
Yeah.
So if we look at the Beatitudes, we actually see, if you look at the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Matthew, let's just stay within the Gospel of Matthew for a second. It seems pretty obvious that Jesus is being portrayed, as you pointed out, as the primary fulfillment of the Beatitudes. So let's just look at some of the Beatitudes. We can go to the slides here. The first Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Well, the idea of being poor, being without material possessions in the Old Testament is linked to trust in God. God is on the side of the poor. Why? Because the poor can't trust in their own resources, in their own abilities, in their own connections, right? They have to rely on God. And so the idea is it's not just enough to be poor, right? You want to be poor in spirit. You want to be like the Anawim in the Old Testament, the poor ones, the little ones who put their faith in God. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, foxes have holes, the birds of the sky have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Here we see the poverty of Jesus on display. In Matthew 5:5, Jesus says, blessed are the meek. And the Greek word that's used there is praus, for they shall inherit the earth. Well, that same word shows up again in Matthew 11, where Jesus says, I am meek and humble of heart. In the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy." Over and over again in the Gospel of Matthew, people come to Jesus and they say, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David," for example, given some references there. And Jesus reveals that he is merciful. So Jesus is the one who is poor. Jesus is the one who is meek. Jesus is the one who is merciful. Likewise, in Matthew 5, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Well, Jesus is the Son of God, right? And Jesus also tells the disciples that they should go out and tell people if the house is worthy, preach the gospel to them, and let your peace come upon it. So Jesus is imparting peace through his disciples. He's a Son of God who imparts peace. Of course, at the end of the Beatitudes, we read, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, in The Chosen, at this point, we see a depiction of John the Baptist. Certainly, John the Baptist is persecuted for righteousness' sake. But the example par excellence of the righteous one who's persecuted would be Jesus, right? And then finally, at the end of the Beatitudes, "Blessed are you when they insult you." And we read this is what they do to Jesus. They knelt before him during the Passion narrative, and they mock him. And so we see over and over again how Jesus is portrayed as the ultimate fulfillment of the Beatitudes. I mean, blessed is a really powerful word here in the Greek, makarios. It literally means, it can have the connotation of happiness, right? It's more than just happiness, though. So blessing is appropriate because the happiness is sourced in God. But the idea is Jesus is basically saying, be like me.
Right.
If you want to know what the moral life is all about, it's not just about these commandments. It's not just about these rules. It's ultimately about becoming like Christ. And so the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount is highlighting that. So I'll just say, I was really disappointed with the way they shifted the emphasis to the Beatitudes ultimately being about the apostles and John the Baptist, rather than being most explicitly seen in the person of Jesus himself. And I felt like there was a kind of narrowing here of the meaning of the Beatitudes, where Jesus looks at Matthew, "Blessed are you when you're insulted," and ultimately and Matthew takes this to heart and he recognizes that Jesus is applying the saying to him, and that's very beautiful and touching. And yet, all of the Beatitudes are applicable to every one of us. And so I feel like that gets a little lost in the shuffle when you emphasize that they are connected to particular disciples.
And it's kind of interesting. There have been consistent themes of this emphasis where Jesus says, "Look at me, put your faith in me." And then there's been a concern about works righteousness or ascribing these things. I can't live up to this call.
Right.
And then here it's all flipped, where it suddenly becomes not primarily about Jesus, but about his disciples doing these things, being merciful, being poor, being meek, making peace. And that concern about works righteousness, which I think is a false one, but still it's kind of evaporated, and all of a sudden they're doing these amazing things.
Right.
So it's just it's not the most consistent. And again, I appreciated the reference to disciples and the kind of affirmation and comfort that is there, but we don't want to lose sight of Christ as the primary referent, and it's in him and through him that we then are able to do these things and to receive that promise of being blessed. That's I think what is at stake here.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, there is a challenge for the producers here, and that is, how do you depict the Sermon on the Mount, and how do you depict these crowds coming to Jesus? Now, the way they do it is, this mass of people have received word from these flyers and from word of mouth, and so they all head out. They're waiting for, as Barnaby calls it, the show. He's corrected, it's not a show, but it kind of feels that way, which is why Barnabas puts it that way. And in the Gospel of Matthew is an interesting little tension that's worth mentioning. So in Matthew 5, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, we read, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. So at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, the people who go to Jesus are his disciples. They're not involved with crowd control. They're not involved with other things. They're there to be the primary learners. They're there to be the primary students. They see Jesus go to a mountain. He's like Moses going up on a mountain. Jesus knew Moses. The disciples go there. He opened his mouth and he taught them, saying, now at the end of the sermon in the Gospel of Matthew, it's interesting. The end of the sermon we read, now when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. So at the beginning of the sermon, you have the disciples just there, and Jesus sort of leaving the crowds. And at the end of the sermon, you have the crowds are now there hearing the teaching. And so the impression that one might get is that the crowds came and kind of trickled up the mountain as Jesus was teaching, and they were astonished at all the amazing things he was teaching. Why? He taught because he had authority, not like the scribes. The scribes would seem to appeal to other authorities. So anyway, this is a challenge for the producers of The Chosen. I see what they did there. When we go back to the text, we're gonna see this. Some people might suggest that we're also getting a little bit of a clue here that Matthew doesn't mean for his presentation to be a kind of video recording of what happened, right? So anyway, Matthew is using some artistic license in presenting Jesus' teaching all in one spot here, and kind of summarizing all of his teaching, his most important teachings, and then describing what the crowds reacted, how the crowds reacted at various times to this. So anyway, that's one possible reading of this. All right.
Yeah. There's a scene that I wanted to lift up before Jesus is coming to the point of heading out there to give this big sermon. There's a kind of quiet moment with his mother, and I really like these moments where they are able to depict something that I think that in my meditation on the gospel maybe wasn't present enough, and that is the tenderness between Jesus and his mother, and the kind of intimacy that they would share. And so let's take a quick look at a clip that demonstrates some of this.
What are you thinking about?
Your father. How we never got to see any of this.
My father? Which one?
I don't know what I mean.
I do miss him. But I'm glad you're here.
I am proud of you.
Maybe wait to say that until after I'm done. In case I mess up in front of such a big crowd.
Whatever you say will be beautiful.
It is pretty good, actually.
So here, as Mary is sort of helping Jesus with the final preparations, he asks her what she's thinking. And I love this line because he's God, right? And he already knows. And so for me, this was a beautiful kind of teaching or symbol on prayer, where it's not that we pray because somehow we're kind of like, well, God, you should know that I'm thinking about this, but instead God already knows. But the invitation to prayer is to give us a chance to express these things, sometimes to confront ourselves with things that we maybe haven't expressed before or articulated before. And so I saw in this little moment Jesus inviting Mary to say what she's thinking, not because he doesn't know, but because it's good for her to be able to express that. And what she's thinking about is Joseph. and how she wishes Joseph could be there. Of course, she says, your father, and Jesus, makes a kind of poignant and sweet joke about, his which father, right? Because he has two, and he knows what she means. And they both express missing Saint Joseph, which again is just a kind of beautiful tribute, I think, to the goodness and beauty of family life. That, of course, God's call and mission surpasses that, but it doesn't mean that family ceases to be good. It's still a very great good. And you see them treasuring their family and treasuring that time that they had together. And as I watched this scene, another point that kind of occurred to me that applies to a lot of The Chosen that I appreciate is overall, Jesus is pretty restrained in his speaking. He invites Mary to say what she's thinking, even though he knows and he could say something. And even the comments that he'll make in return, he's just pretty restrained most of the time. And what I liked about that is I was just thinking about how there's always this temptation to think that because we know something, we ought to say it, and we sometimes just say so many things instead of exercising a kind of discipline or restraint. And I like that there are times when Jesus is wordy in The Chosen, but there are also times when he keeps his comments to a minimum. He doesn't always reveal his divine knowledge. Sometimes I wish he would do it a little bit more, but I have to appreciate the kind of restraint that he shows and the lesson there that, again, just because we know something, many of us are very quick to let other people know what we know, and sometimes we're excited about it too. But I like that Jesus has this kind of discipline or this restraint in what he says. So this was just a kind of little moment in the midst of the bigger narrative that caught my attention and that I appreciated.
One more detail I liked about this episode, I thought it was interesting that Jesus offers an explanation to Matthew about his saying that disciples are to be salt.
Right, salt of the earth.
The salt of the earth, we find that in the Sermon on the Mount. And Matthew expresses a concern. He says that people will hear the Romans' defeat of the city of Carthage and the idea that they salted the fields of Carthage. Now, that really probably didn't happen. That's first claimed in the 19th century. So, okay, this probably didn't happen as part of the Punic Wars. But Jesus responds to Matthew with something interesting. He says, there are 3 reasons for salt. And I love that because so many times people want to reduce the meaning of Jesus's words to one thing and imagine that there isn't a multivalent dimension of Jesus's teaching. And I appreciated that they opened the door to this. And he said the 3 meanings are preservative, flavorful, and remedy, right? The salt is a preservative, so disciples are to be a preservative in the world against corruption and sin. Salt adds flavor, so the disciples are to add flavor, right, to the world, so to speak. And salt is also used as a healing remedy, and the disciples will carry out a healing role in the world.
That
as
last
well.
one was new to me. I had not heard that before. That was interesting to kind of have this healing function.
Now, the one that he doesn't mention that some commentators have pointed out is that salt also has a liturgical connection. And of course, given that this is produced by a Protestant group of producers, I'm not surprised. But it is prominent in the Old Testament. For example, if we go to the slides, Leviticus chapter 2:13, with all your offerings, you shall offer salt. All the sacrifices have to be salted. And so Jesus elsewhere in the gospel says things like something greater than the temple is here. Jesus indicates that the community, the church, serves as a kind of temple when he talks about building on the rock that is Peter. Well, maybe we'll talk about that if that ever appears in an episode. So there is a liturgical dimension to salt that isn't referenced. Nonetheless, overall, I'm pleased to see the producers say, yeah, there are different possible meanings to salt, and we don't have to say it's this and not that. We can see a both and here in Jesus' teaching. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point.
All right. I did like as well, Jesus has to explain to Matthew that it's appropriate to use metaphor. Matthew says, I don't understand all these symbols.
Right.
Why can't you just be plain spoken? And Jesus says, well, Solomon was worse, you know, and there seems to be an allusion here to the Song of Solomon. But anyway, I do appreciate that The Chosen is also recognizing there's a poetic dimension to Jesus' teaching that shouldn't be lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, absolutely.
We also see Yanni and Shammai meet. Yanni and Shmuel meet with Shammai, and they're told to meet with the quote the clerk of the special counsel for false prophecies at the archive.
The archive.
The archive. So I don't think that there's any evidence that there was anything as formal as this in the first century.
And so this is another example of this kind of slightly overly formalized, maybe more institutional, dimensions than were actually there. I did notice in this little exchange, though, because Shmuel is, there are some negative things going on with him, but when he was talking with this representative of the school of Shammai, there's a criticism made of Nicodemus. Basically that the lights aren't on anymore upstairs. And Shmuel, even though he has sort of parted ways with Nicodemus, he's not happy with that disrespect shown. And so I was glad to see a little preservation of kind of reverence towards his former teacher there. So it's not all bad with Shmuel.
Yeah, and that was appropriate because a Jewish figure like Shmuel would have reverenced his teacher. If he's Rabbi Gamaliel, Rabbi literally means my great one. People say it means my teacher. It has that meaning, but there's a deep reverence there that I appreciated was included there. We also have the scene of them, building the stage, and the whole thing is kind of, well, Barnaby refers to it as a show. Let's see that in this last clip. Go to that last clip.
I'm sorry, if we're moving to hear the teacher, why are you turning off the path the others follow?
We're just going to say hello to some old friends before the show.
It's not a show, Barnaby.
It was a show at Zebedee's house.
So this is sort of the climactic moment, right? They're building towards the sermon. We don't actually see it in this season, which was kind of a surprise to me. But we do see
for season 3.
Yeah, we do see the walkout song for Jesus.
Yes, the walkout. Yeah, and
the
baseball's
stage
a walk-up
built.
song. Yeah,
and like you said, I mean, Barnaby kind of makes an offhanded, semi-joking but actually serious comment about the show.
Right.
And I think we both had some. That was not what we expected. Some concerns there. That this production makes it seem, just sort of Jesus the rock star, I guess. If he's got a walkout song with rock music and stuff, then that's how it comes across. And that doesn't really align with the depiction in the Gospels very, very well at all.
And, you do see a distinct Protestant kind of view reflected here, because there is in many Protestant circles, not in all, but in many Protestant circles, an awareness that there's a fine line between a service and a show. And that is constantly on the minds of people because there isn't a liturgical dimension to worship. It's primarily about a stage, a person on a stage. There's a lot of music, but the music is presented in a way that is often indistinguishable from what a concert might look like. That's not in all cases true, but of course in the Catholic tradition, it looks different, and there isn't as much discussion about the liturgy as a show. Certainly, there have been people who have been worried about the priest becoming too much of a central a focal point in the liturgy. But when I go to Mass on Sunday, and I talk to other Catholics who go to Mass, I say, we don't know who the priest is going to be, who's going to say our Mass. That's okay. But there's a radical difference there with a lot of Protestant churches where it really is more about the personality of the preacher than it is about other things.
Yeah, and you sort of, if you don't have a liturgical sensibility and tradition, then you've got to kind of construct something on your own, right? Mm-hmm. There's this you've got to choreograph, construct, what is this going to look like? And that's very different, not only from kind of Catholic sensibilities where you receive a tradition and that in a way frees you from the need to build something, construct something, choreograph something. And I think, for me, the gospel writers, and you mentioned this, Michael, when Matthew is crafting his gospel, he also receives a tradition. Now, it's not, in this case, it's not a liturgical tradition, but it's the tradition of the Torah and the tradition of the receiving of Moses going up onto the mountain, receiving God's word. And so the way the Sermon on the Mount is constructed is, in a way, receiving that given and that tradition and bringing it into and forming it around that. It's not, let's build something on our own and make a stage. And so it can kind of, I think, give the wrong sense of, just what's going on in the gospel, and also perhaps the wrong sense of how to think about liturgical traditions and receiving that. So anyway, that's kind of the the build up and how it goes. And at the end of season 2, I mean, looking back, I was just trying to think of some of the things we really appreciated and then other things we were left with some questions about. And one of the themes that we kept coming back to pretty often was how much we liked that you see some of Jesus' divine knowledge, what we call this higher Christology, and his transcendence. That comes through in a variety of ways, some of them small, some of them clever, others larger. And it's really nice to see when they hit that balance, I think, of the approachable humanity of Christ, but never losing sight of his divinity. And when that's done right, it's really satisfying, I think. And so there were several moments where I really appreciated how that came through over the course of the season. And then you noticed how things were getting a little less, there was a more diversified view of Judaism being portrayed.
I think that's right.
Not without some questions and things, but in season 1, I think we sort of felt like it was monolithic or hegemonic, where it's like, there's one way of somehow being a Jew, or it means one thing. Now we've seen, with different schools of thought and different figures, we're starting to see a little bit of a broadening there that I think is very helpful. But there are other things that we still, had questions about, right? And you mentioned one of them here towards the end, that Jesus' ministry seems to be increasingly portrayed in the way that maybe a Protestant ministry would today. And very understandable. I mean, they're Protestants putting it together. That's well within their, their purview and everything. But it does start to diverge a little bit from the scriptural presentation, I think. And then another point that I had thought of just looking back is I appreciate the focus on, we talked about different meanings of the chosen and the disciples as the chosen ones as well. And there's, this kind of continual effort that I appreciate to show how the life of these early disciples has a lot of parallels with what it means to be a Christian today, right? And so what the life of discipleship is like. I do find myself, it always comes up a little bit short because it's just hampered by a kind of limited sense of how grace transforms us and the depths of the interior life. And really, for me, it's not so much, it's not that I want to lean into a critique of that, but there's such a treasure there for Catholics. And I can remember some of the first times that I encountered kind of the great adventure that God has in store for us in the life of prayer. And it was just so mind-blowing and eye-opening that to not, to kind of miss an opportunity to show that, it's a little hard for me, even though I do appreciate that focus on discipleship and its importance. So, these are some of the things that we have kind of looked at over the course of this season, and you've heard us talk about, but just want to kind of lift up these global thoughts as we've taken a look at and appreciated and criticized and shared our thoughts on season 2. So it's been a journey, and we thank you for joining in with us.
And we also want to thank all the crew, everybody who's been a part of putting this show together, all the technical people, Matthew, and Matthew's doing amazing work editing the show. And I do want to also thank Bensei, who did all of our slides for us and produced all these. Did a wonderful job on those. And just it's been a
had lots of
privilege to
help.
work with all of these fine people who are engaged in this project out of a love for bringing people back to sacred scripture. And so want to acknowledge all of them. And finally, thank you very much, Scott, for doing this.
Thanks
This has
to
been
you
a delight.
too. It has
Yeah.
been a lot of fun. So
Great.
thank you for joining us. As always, please continue to return to Scripture, continue to pray with it, and may we all continue to grow closer to the Lord through prayerful reflection on Scripture. Take care, and God bless you.